Imagine discovering that one of the greatest stories ever told might not be entirely fictional. For nearly 3,000 years, the tale of Odysseus has captivated millions. A brilliant king who outwitted enemies stronger than himself. A sailor who survived storms, monsters, and the wrath of the gods. A husband who spent 20 years fighting to return to the woman he loved. Waiting for him was Penelope, a queen remembered not for conquering kingdoms or leading armies, but for her extraordinary patience and intelligence. While dozens of powerful nobles tried to claim her throne, she found a way to delay them for years, never giving up hope that her husband would return. Together, Odysseus and Penelope became symbols of courage, loyalty, and perseverance. But there is one problem. Outside the pages of the Odyssey, there is no ancient document that clearly proves either of them ever existed. No royal decree, no inscription, no grave bearing their names. For centuries, scholars dismissed them as nothing more than literary creations, characters imagined by the poet Homer to entertain his audience. And for a long time, that conclusion seemed perfectly reasonable. After all, the Odyssey is filled with impossible events. A giant Cyclopes with a single eye, a witch who transforms men into pigs, deadly sirens whose songs lure sailors to their deaths, sea monsters lurking between narrow straits. Even the gods themselves step into the story, guiding or punishing the hero whenever they choose. It sounds less like history and more like fantasy. But what if the fantasy is hiding something real? What if Homer wasn't inventing an entirely new world, but preserving distant memories of one that had already disappeared? Because over the last century and a half, archaeologists have uncovered discoveries that changed how historians think about ancient Greece. They found the ruins of a city that many believed never existed. They uncovered magnificent palaces belonging to forgotten kings. They deciphered an ancient writing system once thought impossible to read. And piece by piece, the civilization behind Homer's poems began to emerge from beneath the earth. Suddenly, questions that once seemed absurd became surprisingly difficult to answer. If Troy was real, if the kingdoms Homer described were real, if powerful warrior kings truly ruled Greece at the end of the Bronze Age, then could there also have been a real king whose remarkable life inspired the legend of Odysseus? And if Odysseus wasn't entirely fictional, who was Penelope? Was she also based on a real queen whose story survived for centuries through oral tradition? Or were both of them simply unforgettable symbols, shaped by generations of storytellers until history and myth became impossible to separate? Today, we're going to follow the evidence, not the myths. We'll compare Homer's poems with archaeology, ancient history, and modern research to answer one question that has fascinated people for nearly 3,000 years. Were Odysseus and Penelope real people? Or are they the greatest fictional characters ever created? The answer is far more complicated and far more fascinating than most people imagine. Let's begin. Why historians once believed Odysseus never existed. For much of modern history, asking whether Odysseus was a real person would have sounded almost ridiculous. To most scholars, the answer was obvious. Of course he wasn't. He belonged to the same world as dragons, giants, and magic. After all, look at the story itself. Odysseus blinds a one-eyed giant. He sails past creatures whose songs drive sailors to their deaths. He visits the underworld and speaks with the dead. He survives a six-headed sea monster. The goddess Athena repeatedly appears to protect him, while Poseidon personally tries to destroy him. Nothing about that sounds like history. It sounds like mythology. And for centuries, that was exactly how people treated the Odyssey. Not as a historical record, not even as an exaggerated biography, simply as one of the greatest works of ancient literature ever written. But there was another reason scholars were skeptical. No one even knew who Homer really was. According to ancient tradition, Homer was a blind poet who lived sometime around the 8th century BC. The problem is that almost everything about him is uncertain. Some historians believe Homer was a single individual, Others think Homer may have been the name later generations gave to a long tradition of oral storytellers. It's even possible that the Iliad and the Odyssey were shaped by several different poets over many decades before finally being written down. If that's true, then the stories may have changed countless times before reaching us. Characters could have grown larger than life. Heroes might have absorbed the exploits of several real warriors. Fantastic adventures may have replaced ordinary events. Like a snowball rolling downhill, every generation could have added another layer to the story. And there was an even bigger problem. If the Trojan War really happened around 1200 BC, Homer wasn't writing about recent history. He was describing events that supposedly took place almost 500 years earlier. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to write an accurate account of people who lived 5 centuries ago, without photographs, without books, without official records. Only stories. Stories told around fires. Stories passed from parents to children. Stories repeated by traveling singers from one village to another. How much would remain unchanged after 500 years? Probably not very much. That enormous gap between the events and the poems made many historians conclude that any historical truth had long since disappeared. By the 19th century, the consensus seemed almost impossible to challenge. The Trojan War was considered a legend. Troy itself was widely believed to be fictional. Odysseus was a mythical hero. Penelope was a literary symbol. And the kingdoms described by Homer were thought to exist only in poetry. Case closed. Or so it seemed. Because while scholars debated ancient texts in libraries across Europe, one man became convinced that they were all wrong. He wasn't a professor. He wasn't even trained as an archaeologist. But he was obsessed with Homer. As a boy, he had read the Iliad so many times that he came to believe it was based on real events. Most people laughed at the idea. He ignored them. He spent years earning a fortune in business, not because he wanted wealth, but because he wanted to finance a dream that almost every expert believed was impossible. He would find the lost city of Troy. And if he succeeded, the history of the ancient world would never be the same. In 1870, armed with little more than Homer's descriptions, determination, and a shovel, he arrived at a lonely hill in northwestern Turkey. Its name was Hisarlik. Almost no one imagined that beneath this ordinary mound lay one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. And what Heinrich Schliemann uncovered there would force historians to ask a question they had dismissed for centuries. What if Homer had been telling the truth, at least in part? The discovery that changed everything for centuries. Troy existed only in poetry. It was the city of King Priam, the home of Hector, and the destination of the most famous siege in ancient literature. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, most scholars believed it had never existed at all. They argued that Homer had simply invented the city to give his story a dramatic setting. To them, the Trojan War belonged in the same category as Atlantis. A fascinating legend, but nothing more. One man refused to accept that conclusion. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and unlike most historians of his time, he believed Homer should be taken seriously. Schliemann wasn't a trained archaeologist. In fact, he made his fortune as a businessman before turning his attention to the ancient world. Since childhood, he had dreamed of proving that the stories in the Iliad were based on real events. While academics dismissed Homer as a poet, Schliemann treated his works almost like a treasure map. Many thought he was wasting his time. In 1870, Schliemann arrived at a hill called Hisarlik, located in what is now northwestern Turkey. The mound looked ordinary enough. Farmers had worked the land for generations, and few people suspected that anything remarkable lay beneath it. But Schliemann was convinced this was the location of ancient Troy. Guided largely by Homer's descriptions, he began digging. At first, the excavation seemed disappointing. Instead of uncovering a single city, Schliemann discovered layer after layer of ancient settlements stacked on top of one another. Over thousands of years, each new city had been built upon the ruins of the previous one, creating an archaeological time capsule unlike anything historians had seen before. Eventually, archaeologists realized there wasn't just one Troy. There were at least 9 major cities buried beneath the hill. Each belonged to a different period of history. Some had been destroyed by earthquakes. Others had been consumed by fire. Several had been rebuilt again and again over centuries. This changed everything. The question was no longer whether Troy had existed. It clearly had. The real mystery became which of these cities, if any, was the Troy described by Homer. Modern archaeology points to a settlement known as Troy 6, and, more likely, its successor, Troy 7a. These cities flourished during the Late Bronze Age, exactly when many historians believe a conflict remembered as the Trojan War could have taken place. Troy 7a, in particular, shows signs of violent destruction around the late 13th or early 12th century BC. Archaeologists found collapsed walls, burned buildings, and evidence that the inhabitants had stored unusually large amounts of food inside their homes, suggesting they may have been preparing for a siege. None of this proves that Achilles fought outside those walls. It doesn't prove that Helen was ever there, and it certainly doesn't prove that a giant wooden horse entered the city. But it does prove something historians once thought impossible. A wealthy, fortified city stood exactly where Homer said Troy had been, and around the same period in which the legends place the war. That city suffered a catastrophic destruction. For the first time, the poems of Homer could no longer be dismissed as pure fantasy. Schliemann himself became an international celebrity. Newspapers hailed him as the man who had discovered Troy. Although many of his excavation methods would later be criticized for being destructive and rushed, his greatest achievement remained undeniable. He had forced the academic world to reconsider one of its oldest assumptions. Then another discovery made the story even more remarkable. As archaeologists continued excavating across Greece, they uncovered enormous palaces unlike anything described in classical Greek history. Massive stone walls, royal throne rooms, elaborate frescoes, storerooms filled with weapons and luxury goods, and royal tombs overflowing with gold revealed the existence of a forgotten civilization. This civilization had flourished centuries before classical Athens. It possessed powerful kings. It built magnificent fortresses. It dominated the Aegean Sea, and it disappeared so completely that even the ancient Greeks remembered it only through legends. Today, we call it the Mycenaean civilization, and the more archaeologists learned about these forgotten kingdoms, the more surprising one fact became. The world Homer described was beginning to look remarkably real. The palaces, the warrior kings, the bronze weapons, the political alliances, and even many of the place names in the Iliad and the Odyssey, all had counterparts in the archaeological record. Perhaps Homer hadn't invented an imaginary age after all. Perhaps he had preserved distant memories of a civilization that had vanished hundreds of years before he was born. If that was true, then one question became impossible to ignore. If Agamemnon ruled a real kingdom, if Nestor ruled a real kingdom, if Menelaus ruled a real kingdom, then what about the king of Ithaca? Could Odysseus have been more than just a legend? That question leads us to another mystery, one that archaeologists are still trying to solve today. Where was the real kingdom of Ithaca? Where was the real kingdom of Ithaca? If there was ever a real Odysseus, he had to rule somewhere. According to Homer, that place was Ithaca, a small, rocky island in the Ionian Sea. It wasn't the richest kingdom in Greece, nor the most powerful. Odysseus himself admits that his homeland was rugged and mountainous, better suited for raising goats than growing crops. Yet despite its modest size, Ithaca occupied a strategic position along important sea routes, making it an ideal base for a skilled sailor and trader. Today, there is still an island called Ithaca, located just off the western coast of Greece. At first glance, the mystery seems solved. Odysseus was king of Ithaca. The island still exists. Case closed, but archaeology has a habit of making simple answers much more complicated. When researchers compared Homer's descriptions with the geography of the modern island, they noticed something strange. In the Odyssey, Ithaca is described as the westernmost island among several neighboring islands. Yet today's Ithaca is actually east of the much larger island of Kephallonia. That detail may seem insignificant, but for historians, it raised an uncomfortable question. Had Homer made a geographical mistake, or was the real Ithaca somewhere else entirely? Over the last century, dozens of theories have attempted to answer that question. Some scholars argue that Homer wasn't trying to create a precise map. After all, ancient epic poetry wasn't written as a navigation guide. Small geographical inconsistencies could easily have appeared after centuries of oral storytelling. Others believe the landscape itself may have changed dramatically since the Bronze Age. The Ionian Islands lie in one of the most earthquake-prone regions of Europe. Powerful earthquakes have reshaped coastlines, triggered landslides, and altered harbors for thousands of years. It's possible that the coastline Homer described looked very different 3,000 years ago. Then there is another theory, one that has sparked decades of debate. Some researchers believe the true homeland of Odysseus wasn't modern Ithaca at all. Instead, they point to a peninsula on the neighboring island of Kephallonia called Peliki. According to this hypothesis, Peliki may once have been a separate island, divided from Kephallonia by a narrow sea channel that was later filled by landslides and earthquakes. If that were true, Peliki would match several geographical details in the Odyssey far better than modern Ithaca. The idea gained international attention in the early 2000s. Geologists examined the region, archaeologists debated the evidence. Historians revisited Homer's descriptions. Some found the theory convincing, others remained deeply skeptical. To this day, no consensus has been reached. And that's exactly what makes the mystery so fascinating. Unlike many ancient legends that can be dismissed immediately, the question of Ithaca remains genuinely open. But regardless of whether Odysseus ruled modern Ithaca, Peliki, or another nearby island, archaeology has revealed something important. The Ionian Islands were not isolated backwaters during the late Bronze Age. They were part of an active network of trade and seafaring that connected mainland Greece with Italy, Sicily, Crete, and the eastern Mediterranean. Ships carried olive oil, wine, pottery, bronze, precious metals, and luxury goods across these waters long before the classical Greek civilization emerged. This was a world of experienced sailors, a world where navigation determined wealth and survival, a world where a clever captain could become as valuable as a powerful warrior. Suddenly, Odysseus begins to look less like a fantasy hero and more like a man shaped by his environment. His greatest weapon was rarely his sword. It was his mind. Again and again in the Odyssey, he survives not because he is stronger than his enemies, but because he is smarter. He negotiates, he deceives, he plans, he adapts. Those qualities would have been essential for any Bronze Age ruler whose kingdom depended on trade, diplomacy, and dangerous sea voyages. In many ways, Odysseus doesn't resemble the larger-than-life warriors of legend. He resembles a practical king trying to survive in an unpredictable world. Then, in 2010, archaeologists announced a discovery that reignited the debate. High in the hills of modern Ithaca, they uncovered the remains of a large Mycenaean complex dating to roughly the same period traditionally associated with the Trojan War. The site included impressive stone walls, staircases carved into bedrock, underground water systems, storage facilities, and evidence of elite occupation. Some newspapers rushed to publish sensational headlines. Odysseus's palace found. It was exactly the kind of discovery people had dreamed about for generations. But was it really his palace? Or had excitement outrun the evidence? The answer, as it often does in archaeology, is far more complicated. And to understand why, we need to take a closer look at what was actually discovered beneath the soil of Ithaca. The search for Odysseus' palace. When news broke in 2010 that archaeologists may have discovered the palace of Odysseus, headlines around the world exploded. Has the home of the legendary king finally been found? For many people, it sounded like the mystery had finally been solved. But archaeology is rarely that simple. The site, located near the village of Exogi in northern Ithaca, had actually been under investigation for years. As excavations continued, researchers uncovered something extraordinary. Hidden beneath centuries of soil and vegetation were the remains of a large Mycenaean complex, dating to roughly the 13th century BC, the same period traditionally associated with the Trojan War. The discovery immediately attracted attention because of its scale. This wasn't an ordinary farmhouse. It wasn't a small village. It appeared to be an elite administrative center. Archaeologists uncovered massive stone terraces built into the hillside, carefully designed stairways, sophisticated drainage systems, underground cisterns capable of storing fresh water, and the foundations of a substantial multi-room building. Pottery fragments, storage jars, and other artifacts confirmed that the site had been occupied during the late Bronze Age. Whoever lived here was almost certainly a member of the local elite, perhaps even the ruler of the island. For those hoping to find Odysseus, the discovery seemed almost too perfect. A Mycenaean palace on Ithaca, dating to the right period. Could this finally be the home of the man who inspired the Odyssey? Not so fast. Despite the excitement, archaeologists quickly pointed out an important limitation. Nowhere at the site was there an inscription mentioning Odysseus. No royal seal carried his name, no clay tablet identified the owner, no statue, monument, or burial linked the complex to the legendary king. In other words, while the palace was real, its owner remains completely unknown. This is one of the greatest challenges in Bronze Age archaeology. Unlike later civilizations such as Egypt or Rome, written records from Mycenaean Greece are extremely limited. Many were written on clay tablets using a script known as Linear B. These tablets mostly recorded practical matters: livestock, grain, taxes, weapons, and inventories. They were administrative documents, not history books. Even more importantly, most of them were accidentally preserved only because the palaces burned down. When fire swept through these buildings, the intense heat baked the clay tablets hard enough for them to survive thousands of years underground. Without those fires, nearly all of them would have dissolved back into dust. And even among the surviving tablets, no document mentions a King Odysseus ruling Ithaca. Does that mean he never existed? Not necessarily. Think about how little evidence survives from 3,000 years ago. Entire cities have vanished, libraries have disappeared, wooden buildings have rotted away, papyrus scrolls have turned to dust. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Historians encounter this problem constantly. Many rulers of the Bronze Age are known only because a single inscription happened to survive. Others are mentioned by neighboring kingdoms but leave no records of their own. Some probably ruled for decades without leaving behind a single written trace. Odysseus, if he existed, could easily belong to that category. Still, the discovery on Ithaca accomplished something significant. It demonstrated that the island was capable of supporting an elite ruler during exactly the period in which Homer placed his hero. For generations, critics had argued that Ithaca was too poor and insignificant to produce a king worthy of epic poetry. Archaeology told a different story. The island may have been small, but it was clearly integrated into the wider Mycenaean world. Trade routes connected it with mainland Greece, the Peloponnese, Crete, and the western Mediterranean. Imported pottery found on the island showed that its inhabitants were far from isolated. This was not the forgotten backwater many had imagined. It was part of a sophisticated maritime network stretching across the Aegean Sea. And that fits surprisingly well with Homer's portrayal of Odysseus. Unlike Agamemnon, who ruled a vast kingdom, or Achilles, whose fame rested on his unmatched strength, Odysseus was never described as the richest or most powerful king. His greatest advantage was his understanding of the sea. He knew the islands, he knew the winds, he knew the ports. He knew how to negotiate, deceive, and survive. Those are exactly the qualities one might expect from the ruler of a small island kingdom whose prosperity depended on maritime trade rather than military conquest. The palace on Ithaca doesn't prove that Odysseus lived there, but it proves something almost as important. The kind of ruler Homer described could have existed. The setting was real, The political system was real. The royal residence was real. The timeline was plausible. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Yet one crucial question still remained unanswered. Even if a king ruled Ithaca during the Late Bronze Age, was that king truly the man remembered as Odysseus? Or had centuries of storytelling transformed several real leaders into a single, unforgettable hero? To answer that question, we have to leave archaeology behind for a moment and examine the man himself. Who was Odysseus? And how much of his legendary character actually belongs in history? Could Odysseus have been a real king? At this point, the evidence leaves us with an interesting conclusion. We know that Troy was real. We know that Mycenaean kingdoms ruled Greece during the Late Bronze Age. We know that Ithaca was inhabited by an elite capable of building impressive royal residences. So the question is no longer whether the world of the Odyssey existed. It clearly did. The real question is much more personal. Did a man named Odysseus actually rule there? Unfortunately, archaeology cannot answer that question directly. No inscription has ever been found bearing his name. No royal tomb has been identified as his. No contemporary document records his exploits. But history is full of famous people who left surprisingly little evidence behind. Many rulers from the Bronze Age are known only because neighboring kingdoms happened to mention them. Others vanished from history entirely, remembered only through fragments of oral tradition. In an age when writing was rare and records were easily destroyed by war, fire, or time, countless lives disappeared without leaving a trace. Could Odysseus have been one of them? Many historians think that's entirely possible. In fact, there are three main theories about who Odysseus really was. The first is the simplest. Odysseus never existed. According to this view, Homer created him as a fictional hero designed to entertain audiences and teach moral lessons. Ancient storytellers often invented memorable characters, and there is no rule that says every hero must have been based on a real person. This remains a perfectly respectable position, and many classicists still support it today. But there is another theory that has gained increasing attention over the last century. Perhaps Odysseus did exist, not as the monster-slaying hero we know from mythology, but as a real Mycenaean ruler whose life gradually transformed into legend. Imagine a king who fought in a military campaign across the Aegean. He survives the war. His return home is delayed by storms, political unrest, or failed expeditions. Years later, stories about his adventures begin spreading from village to village. Each storyteller adds a new detail. Each generation makes the tale a little more exciting. A dangerous coastline becomes a sea monster. A hostile tribe becomes a race of giants. A clever escape becomes a miraculous intervention by the gods. After 500 years, history and imagination become impossible to separate. This process wasn't unusual. In fact, it happened throughout the ancient world. Alexander the Great became the hero of fantastical medieval romances. King Arthur, if he existed at all, was transformed into a ruler surrounded by magic swords, enchanted forests, and mythical knights. Even real Viking explorers eventually became larger-than-life figures in Norse sagas. Why should Odysseus be any different? Then there is a third possibility. Perhaps there was never a single Odysseus. Instead, Homer may have combined the stories of several different people into one unforgettable character. Think about the qualities that define him. He is an experienced sailor, a skilled diplomat, a fearless warrior, a brilliant strategist, a persuasive speaker, a devoted husband, a restless explorer. It's entirely possible that these traits belong to different individuals living across generations. One famous captain may have inspired the sea voyages. Another king may have been remembered for his political wisdom. A third warrior could have contributed stories from the Trojan campaign. Over centuries, those separate traditions may have merged into one legendary hero. Surprisingly, this idea fits well with how oral traditions often evolve. Storytellers rarely preserve history word for word. Instead, they preserve what people remember: remarkable victories, unexpected betrayals, acts of courage, moments of extraordinary intelligence. As time passes, memorable stories survive while ordinary details disappear. Eventually, several lives can become one. But there's something about Odysseus that makes many historians pause. Unlike Achilles, whose almost superhuman strength places him firmly in the world of epic heroes, Odysseus often succeeds through qualities that feel surprisingly human. He lies, he negotiates, he disguises himself, he studies his enemies before acting. He waits patiently for the right opportunity. Again and again, he wins not because he is the strongest man in the room, but because he understands people better than they understand him. Those aren't supernatural abilities. They're the skills of an experienced ruler. In many ways, Odysseus resembles a Bronze Age king far more than a mythical demigod. He commands ships, he forms alliances, he solves political crises, he worries about loyalty. He fears rebellion at home. He fights not only foreign enemies, but also the chaos threatening his own kingdom. Strip away the Cyclopes, the sirens, and the gods, and what remains is the portrait of a remarkably believable leader. Perhaps that's why the legend has endured for nearly 3,000 years. Not because people believed every monster was real, but because they recognized something genuine in the man at the center of the story. Yet if Odysseus may have been inspired by a real king, what about the woman who waited for him? Penelope is often remembered as the faithful wife who spent 20 years hoping her husband would return. But was she simply a literary symbol of loyalty? Or could her story also have been rooted in the lives of real women who ruled while their husbands were away at war? To answer that, we need to look beyond the hero and toward one of the most remarkable women in all of Greek mythology. Was Penelope based on a real queen? When people think about the Odyssey, they usually remember Odysseus. He's the hero, the adventurer, the man who outwitted monsters and survived impossible odds. But without Penelope, there wouldn't be much of a story to return to. She is often portrayed as the faithful wife who spent 20 years waiting for her husband. While Odysseus battled enemies across the Mediterranean, Penelope remained in Ithaca, surrounded by more than 100 ambitious noblemen, each hoping to marry her and claim the throne. At first glance, her role seems passive. She waits, she weaves, she hopes. But when you look more closely, Penelope may be one of the most politically intelligent characters in all of Greek literature. Think about her situation. For nearly 2 decades, the king is gone. No one knows whether he's alive or dead. His son, Telemachus, is still too young to secure his father's authority. Powerful aristocrats occupy the royal palace, consume the kingdom's wealth, and pressure the queen to choose a new husband. This isn't simply a family drama. It's a constitutional crisis. In the Bronze Age, a kingdom without a recognized ruler was vulnerable to collapse. Rival noble families could compete for power, alliances could fall apart, and neighboring kingdoms might seize the opportunity to interfere. Every day that Penelope delayed making a decision, she was buying time, not only for herself, but for the survival of Odysseus's dynasty. Her most famous strategy has become legendary. She announced that she would choose a new husband only after finishing a funeral shroud for her elderly father-in-law, Laertes. Every day she sat before her loom and worked diligently. Every night, after everyone had gone to sleep, she secretly unraveled everything she had woven during the day. For 3 years, no one discovered the deception. Only after one of her servants betrayed the secret did the suitors realize they had been outsmarted. It's one of the cleverest episodes in the Odyssey. And notice something interesting. The trick doesn't rely on magic. It doesn't involve the gods. It depends entirely on intelligence, patience, and political calculation. Those are exactly the same qualities that define Odysseus himself. In many ways, Penelope is his equal. She simply fights a different kind of battle. But was she a real person? Unlike some legendary queens whose names appear in inscriptions or royal records, Penelope has left no direct archaeological trace. No palace identifies her. No grave bears her name. No Bronze Age tablet records her existence. As with Odysseus, the historical evidence is silent. Yet historians have noticed something intriguing. The society described in the Odyssey reflects a world in which royal women could hold enormous influence while kings were absent. Although Mycenaean Greece was dominated by male rulers, queens played important political roles. They supervised palace households, managed servants, controlled valuable resources, participated in religious ceremonies, and helped maintain dynastic stability. The title of queen carried real authority. If a king died unexpectedly, his widow could become one of the most important figures in the kingdom. That historical reality makes Penelope's story surprisingly believable. She's not leading armies, she's preserving legitimacy. She's protecting her son's inheritance. She's preventing ambitious nobles from seizing power before the rightful ruler, or his heir, can reclaim the throne. Those are exactly the kinds of responsibilities a Bronze Age queen might have faced. Some scholars believe Penelope may have been inspired by one real queen. Others think she represents many women whose names have been lost to history. Throughout the late Bronze Age, countless rulers would have left home for military campaigns, diplomatic missions, or long trading expeditions. Some never returned. Their wives would have faced uncertainty, political pressure, and difficult decisions remarkably similar to those described in the Odyssey. Perhaps Penelope isn't the memory of one woman. Perhaps she is the memory of many. There's another detail that often goes unnoticed. Unlike many women in Greek mythology, Penelope is never defined by supernatural powers or extraordinary beauty alone. She isn't a goddess. She isn't a warrior. She doesn't possess magical abilities. Her greatest strengths are emotional resilience, self-control, intelligence, and an almost unbreakable sense of duty. These qualities make her feel remarkably human. Perhaps that's why readers have admired her for nearly 3,000 years, not because she performed miracles, but because she endured uncertainty longer than almost anyone could imagine. In fact, if we remove the mythical elements from the Odyssey, Penelope may be one of the most historically plausible characters in the entire poem. A queen protecting her family's throne, a mother raising the heir to the kingdom alone, a skilled politician navigating dangerous rivalries inside the royal court. Nothing about that requires monsters or gods. It only requires history. Yet if Odysseus and Penelope were inspired by real people, what about the most unbelievable parts of the story? The Cyclopes, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the Lotus Eaters. For centuries, these creatures have been used as proof that the Odyssey is pure fantasy. But what if they weren't meant to be taken literally? What if some of the poem's greatest monsters were actually based on real places, real dangers, and real encounters that Bronze Age sailors experienced on their voyages across the Mediterranean? That possibility may be the most fascinating mystery of all. The truth behind the monsters. If there's one reason people dismiss the Odyssey as pure fantasy, it's the monsters. A one-eyed giant, women whose songs lure sailors to their deaths, a six-headed beast that devours entire crews, a whirlpool powerful enough to swallow ships whole. At first glance, these creatures seem to place the story firmly in the realm of mythology. But what if that isn't the whole picture? What if the monsters weren't invented out of nothing? What if they were inspired by real places, real dangers, and real experiences that Bronze Age sailors struggled to explain? For thousands of years, sailors crossing the Mediterranean faced storms, reefs, strange coastlines, unfamiliar peoples, and powerful sea currents. Without modern maps or scientific knowledge, these hazards often became stories. And over generations, stories have a remarkable way of transforming reality into legend. Let's begin with one of the most famous monsters of all, the Cyclopes. In Homer's tale, Odysseus and his men enter a cave belonging to Polyphemus, a gigantic shepherd with a single eye in the center of his forehead. After trapping the sailors inside, the giant begins eating them one by one until Odysseus blinds him and escapes beneath a flock of sheep. It's an unforgettable episode, But could it have been inspired by something real? One fascinating theory points to the Mediterranean islands, where the fossilized skulls of prehistoric dwarf elephants have been discovered. Unlike human skulls, these fossils have a large opening in the center of the forehead where the animal's trunk was attached. To someone unfamiliar with elephants, that opening could easily be mistaken for the socket of one enormous eye. Imagine ancient sailors discovering such a skull inside a cave. Without knowledge of extinct animals, what conclusion might they have reached? Perhaps that giants once lived there. Another possibility is that the Cyclopes represented encounters with isolated mountain tribes whose language and customs seemed completely foreign to visiting sailors. History is full of examples where unfamiliar cultures were transformed into mythical beings by outsiders. Then there are the sirens. Modern art usually portrays them as beautiful women singing from rocky shores. But Homer never actually describes them that way. He simply says their voices were irresistible. Anyone who listened abandoned all caution, steering directly toward them until their ship was destroyed. Some historians believe the sirens may symbolize dangerous coastlines, where hidden reefs and strong currents wrecked countless vessels. Sailors who survived would naturally search for an explanation. Why did experienced captains suddenly lose control? Perhaps because they had been enchanted. The story became easier to remember than the geography. Next comes Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters positioned on opposite sides of a narrow strait. One snatches sailors from the decks of passing ships. The other creates a terrifying whirlpool capable of swallowing entire vessels. This description is surprisingly familiar to anyone who has sailed through the Strait of Messina, the narrow passage separating Sicily from mainland Italy. Even today, the strait is known for its unpredictable currents, powerful eddies, changing winds, and dangerous navigation. Ancient mariners had no engines, no weather forecasts, and only limited knowledge of local waters. Passing through the strait could be terrifying. Over time, those natural hazards may have become two unforgettable monsters, one hidden among the cliffs, the other beneath the waves. The lotus eaters present another mystery. After landing on an unfamiliar shore, several of Odysseus' men eat the fruit of the lotus plant and immediately lose all desire to continue their journey. They forget their homes, abandon their mission, and wish only to remain where they are forever. Some researchers associate this story with North Africa, where ancient writers described plants with mild narcotic or sedative effects. Others argue that the lotus eaters symbolize the psychological temptation to give up after years of exhausting travel. Not every monster has to represent a creature. Sometimes it represents a state of mind. Then there's the witch Circe, who transforms Odysseus' companions into pigs. No historian believes this happened literally. Yet many cultures use animal transformations as metaphors for human behavior. A group of drunken, violent, or undisciplined men might easily be compared to swine. Ancient storytellers often expressed moral lessons through magical transformations rather than direct descriptions. Even the journey to the underworld may have a real-world inspiration. Throughout the Mediterranean, caves emitting strange gases or disappearing deep beneath the earth were believed to be entrances to the realm of the dead. The ancient Greeks identified several such places where pilgrims performed rituals to communicate with deceased relatives. To modern readers, these stories seem supernatural. To people living 3,000 years ago, they were part of the landscape. Does this mean every adventure in the Odyssey has a historical explanation? Not at all. Some episodes were almost certainly created to entertain audiences or emphasize moral themes. Others may combine several traditions into a single narrative. But what makes the Odyssey remarkable is that the boundary between myth and reality is never completely clear. Again and again, archaeologists discover that places once dismissed as fictional actually existed. Historians find that seemingly impossible stories contain surprising fragments of truth, and the deeper we investigate, the more difficult it becomes to separate history from imagination. Which brings us to the final question. After examining the archaeology, the geography, the forgotten kingdoms, and the legends themselves, what verdict can we honestly reach? Were Odysseus and Penelope real people? Or is the truth even more fascinating than a simple yes or no? The final verdict: myth, history, or both? So, after thousands of years of debate, what can we honestly say? Were Odysseus and Penelope real people? The most truthful answer is neither a simple yes nor a simple no. Instead, it lies somewhere in the fascinating space between history and legend. Let's begin with what we know. 300 years ago, many historians believed that nearly everything in Homer's poems was fictional. Troy was thought to be an imaginary city. The kings of Mycenae were considered legendary. The world of the Iliad and the Odyssey seemed no more real than the tales of Hercules or Perseus. Today, that view has changed dramatically. Archaeologists have uncovered the ruins of Troy. They have excavated magnificent Mycenaean palaces across Greece. They have deciphered the linear B writing system, proving that sophisticated kingdoms existed centuries before classical Athens. They have revealed a Bronze Age civilization remarkably similar to the one Homer described. In other words, the stage was real. The kingdoms were real. The cities were real. The political system was real. The trade routes were real. Even many of the geographical locations mentioned by Homer actually existed. That alone is an extraordinary discovery. But when we move from places to people, certainty begins to disappear. No archaeological evidence has yet identified a king named Odysseus. No inscription confirms that Penelope ruled Ithaca. No royal tomb bears either of their names. If such evidence exists, it has not yet been found, and it may never be. After more than 3,000 years, countless records have been destroyed by war, earthquakes, fire, erosion, and simple passage of time. Entire civilizations have vanished with far more documentation than the Mycenaeans ever possessed. Expecting perfect evidence from the late Bronze Age may simply be unrealistic. That is why many historians now favor a middle ground. They suggest that Homer was neither writing pure history nor pure fiction. Instead, he was preserving memories. Real places mixed with legendary adventures. Historical rulers blended with fictional heroes. Authentic political struggles wrapped inside unforgettable stories. Imagine hearing the same tale told by hundreds of storytellers over 5 centuries. Each generation remembers what matters most: the brave king, the faithful queen, the long voyage home, the impossible challenges. Some details disappear, others grow larger. Storms become angry gods. Dangerous coastlines become monsters. Clever escapes become miracles. Eventually, history and mythology become impossible to separate. Perhaps that is exactly what happened with Odysseus. Maybe there really was a king who returned from a distant war after years of hardship. Maybe there were several kings whose stories gradually merged into one. Or perhaps Homer created an entirely fictional hero while borrowing authentic details from the world around him. The truth may never be known. Yet in some ways, that uncertainty is precisely what has kept the story alive. If archaeologists discovered an inscription tomorrow reading, "Odysseus, King of Ithaca," one mystery would disappear forever. The debate would end. But because the evidence remains incomplete, every new excavation has the potential to change our understanding. Every newly deciphered tablet, every forgotten palace, every buried city, every ancient harbor. Each discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that is still unfinished. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. History is rarely as simple as we want it to be. The past isn't divided neatly into fact and fiction. Sometimes legends preserve truths that official records forget. Sometimes archaeology confirms stories once dismissed as impossible. And sometimes the greatest mysteries remain mysteries, not because they lack evidence, but because the evidence refuses to tell a complete story. Whether Odysseus was a real king or a legendary hero, his journey has endured for nearly 3,000 years. Whether Penelope was a historical queen or a symbol of unwavering loyalty, her patience has inspired generations across countless cultures. Their names have survived longer than those of many rulers whose existence is beyond question. Perhaps that tells us something important. History remembers facts, but stories remember people, and the greatest stories often contain just enough truth to keep us searching forever. So, were Odysseus and Penelope real? The honest answer is that we don't know. But we do know this. The world they inhabited was real. The civilization that inspired their story was real. And every year, archaeologists uncover new evidence that brings us one step closer to understanding how myth and history became woven together into one of humanity's greatest epics. Maybe that's why the Odyssey still fascinates us today. Not because it gives us all the answers, but because, after 3,000 years, it continues to ask one of history's greatest questions. Where does history end and legend begin? If you've enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries, don't forget to subscribe for more stories where archaeology, ancient civilizations, and forgotten history come together. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't the ones we find underground. They're the ones that completely change the way we see the past. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.